we're taught in school that stories and storytelling are about changing other people, about persuading them, about marketing, about getting other people to kind of do what we want them to do. But actually, stories are there for personal growth, to help us to imagine the other possibilities in our own life narrative. And the reason I went on and ended up studying literature and now teach literature was after I got through neuroscience and had done all that work, I started to really think to myself, what is the most imaginative literature? At first I thought, well, it has to be fantasy or science fiction or something like that. But actually, Shakespeare is much more challenging, because what Shakespeare's doing is he's connecting with you as a human person and then trying to get you to imagine yourself being different. All of us have a very hard time imagining ourselves changing, and all of Shakespeare's plays are about individuals trying to change, sometimes tragically, sometimes successfully. And that was when I realized, look, these are the works that I want to study, because they're the most focused on the hardest, but actually the most useful work that we can do as individuals, which is imagine that different story of ourselves.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jay Scherr, host of Business Minds Coffee Chat, where you get a captivating look inside the minds of game changers, risk takers, and visionaries who turn ideas into breakthroughs that shake up the world. Our mission is to give you fresh ways to think that spark growth in your business and life so you can make a mark that lasts. I thought a good starting point, just to kick things off, would be for you to share with all of us what your favorite thing is about yourself and why that particular thing.
I guess my favorite thing about myself is my job. I feel like I've just been really, really lucky to have a job where I'm allowed to do all the things that I want to do. And that has been a huge pleasure for me, because it's allowed me to kind of satisfy my curiosity and a lot of my own kind of personal drives. But also it's been really lucky because I'm an educator, because I'm a teacher. I've been able to kind of meet extraordinary people, kind of wrestle with really hard questions, kind of work across communities to do sort of interesting things. So I think I'm one of the very lucky people out there who happens to have fallen into just the right job for them.
Oh, that's fantastic. So if you were to describe your job to someone who knows nothing about you, knows nothing about what you do, maybe is not in a collegiate environment, how would you describe it to someone?
So my background is in neurophysiology, which is kind of a branch of neuroscience. And because I have this very sort of unusual theory of how the human mind works, most of what my day is getting phone calls from people who say, we're having a hard problem that we don't know how to solve because existing theories of psychology and neuroscience aren't helping us figure it out. Would you be willing to come in and hang out with us? And so I spend a lot of my time hanging out with special operators, hanging out with doctors, hanging out with entrepreneurs. And a lot of what I do is I kind of embed in those workplaces. And what we kind of do is we develop different models and understandings of how intelligence is working there that helps them get more out of the successful parts of their operation, and then figure out how to transfer those successful parts to other parts that aren't performing as well.
Interesting. So what would be a starting point? So let's just use an example of an entrepreneur that calls you up one day and describes a problem or an issue that they're experiencing in their business, and they're asking for some help. They're stuck. They don't know what to do. What would be the first type of conversation that you would have with them to try to pull something out where you can bridge the gap between where they are and what they're looking to achieve?
So if it's possible, I actually like not to have any conversations at all. I like to just go into their environment and watch them. If we do have conversations, we have like a little trick that we learned from special operations, which is called you're allowed to ask any question except for why. And if you'd like, I could talk about why that works. But the main thing when it comes to work with entrepreneurs that I usually find is entrepreneurs have tremendous vision. They're natural leaders and creatives usually, but then they experience a lot of friction and frustration passing those skills on to the people around them and to the organization around them. And so the number one challenge that we often find with entrepreneurs is how to communicate and connect with what's already in their head with the people around them, because to be an entrepreneur is essentially to be living in the future while everyone else around you is living in the present. And how do you make that connection? How do you bridge that gap? And so a lot of the work we do with entrepreneurs is essentially getting them to slow down their own mental processes and then help other people jump into those mental processes and then accelerate so that they can reach you where you are.
Okay, that is so interesting. But I do have to ask about the being able to ask any question other than why. So why not asking about why?
Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to surface things that people don't know. And if you ask someone why, you're going to get their best possible explanation. And really what you want to do is you want to find the explanation that they haven't come up with already. So this comes up, we learned this, so this is a sort of a weird and fascinating story, but basically, I was brought in to do a lot of work with Army Special Operations, and at some point, I was involved with a group whose job is essentially a version of interrogation. Not aggressive interrogation, but, going in places and trying to extract as much information as you can. And just like we were talking about earlier, I said, I don't want to talk to you about how you do your job, I just want to watch you do your job. And so I got to sit and watch them do their job. And what I noticed is that 95% of the questions that they asked were who, what, when, where, how. They almost never asked why. And so after that was over, I asked them why. And the moment that I asked them why, they immediately just jumped to an explanation, which turned out to be the wrong explanation. Because when you ask why, you elicit the best thing that's at the top of people's head. And so what we actually did is we actually started to look, kind of study the psychology of people when they're being asked questions. And first of all, when you ask someone why, a lot of times you'll prompt a defensive response. So if someone does something odd and you're like, why did you do that? Then they'll be like, oh, I've got to come up with a way to explain or rationalize that, Or even if it's not defensive, they'll just give you what they have already thought. But you're not digging deeper. And really the key to life is understanding the people around you better than they understand themselves. Understanding the processes around you better than they understand themselves. So that means you have to surface novel-wise. How do you surface novel-wise? Well, your brain's mechanism for doing that is to lean into surprises, or as we call them, anomalies. Anomalies are things that disrupt the rules, the kind of expectations and kind of standard operating procedures of your environment. And the way you surface anomalies is when you see something surprising, you then start to ask who, what, when, where, how questions about that. So you say, oh, when did you decide to do that? And in what occasions do you do it? Where do you not do it? And who do you find that's effective with? Those kinds of questions. And then you start to surface more things. And when those things start to trigger surprise, you focus on that surprise. And the more you're able to do that, the more you surface information that is really significant, because it's triggering this sense of wonder in you, because it's anomalous, because it's singular, because it can't be explained. And the more you sit with that information without rushing to a why, without trying to do the thing that we all do, which is get on the internet and find the answer immediately, the more you sit with that, the more you start to expand your imagination and you start to come up with possibilities. And that's really the key. And so that's why we always say, don't start with why. Apologies to Simon Sinek. We say, don't start with why.
Sorry, Simon. Well, that is truly fascinating. So I'd like for you, because we're going to spend some time obviously talking about the power of stories and narrative. I'd love it if you would take us back a bit to your youth. And what I'd love to find out from you specifically is when your passion for stories really started for you. And, as you're sharing that with us, can you share with us what stories represented to you at an early age in life? And then I want to maybe pull the timeline forward and see how that has changed or shifted for you over the years. So let's start early years, when you first had a passion for stories and what they represented for you.
Yeah, well, like most kids, I was fascinated with stories from a really young age. I mean, just really any kind of stories. I used to love to read simple comic books, simple picture books, things like that, and just sort of imagine. And my parents were hippies, so they hated technology. And so we were not allowed to watch TV in my house. In fact, TV was banned in my house. And so what that meant was that in order to amuse myself, I had to read books. And so I spent a lot of time as a kid, not just kind of reading the books that we had from the library, but because I got bored, I would go and start reading my parents' books. I was about 5 and a half when I read Jaws for the first time, which I would not recommend you give to children because, of course, there's a lot of things in there, including a shark. But from a very young age, I was really, really fascinated with stories as a place of possibility. Because the whole thing about stories is we often hear, I think, inappropriately that they're places of escape or they're places of fantasy. But really, stories are about places of vision. They're about places where things can happen that haven't happened yet. Really famously, the Wright brothers, I know, Jay, you and I both have a sort of connection to Ohio. You know, yes. The Wright brothers have a connection to Ohio. They invented the airplane. And their dad had a rule, which was that they could skip school any day they wanted as long as they read a novel by like Charles Dickens or Washington Irving or any of those kinds of 19th century classic novelists. And they credited that with building their sense of imagination. And that imagination allowed them to see the future faster. It allowed them to go beyond math and probability. 5 years before they built their plane, it was mathematically proven by Lord Kelvin, the world's most eminent statistician at the time, that there would never be an airplane. But because they had read these books, because they had this imagination, they were able to see things that were possible. So as a child, you know that, right? As a child, you're really interested in possibility. As a parent, you're interested in shutting down possibility and getting kids to behave. And, and the more you become an adult, the more you get locked into, well, this is the way things are because this is the way they've always been. But as a child, you have that sense that life can be more than it is now. Stories really feed that. That's why they're not ultimately there for communicating so much as they're there for imagining. So that's kind of my origin story as far as stories go.
That's really interesting. So, staying in your youth here for just a couple more moments. So, as you're reading these, different books and comic books and so forth and exploring your own curiosity, were you and your parents, were they encouraging the conversation around curiosity and really thinking about what's possible that may not be available today, but were you having those kinds of conversations with them?
So my parents were incredible parents. They are incredible parents. They're incredible people. But I grew up in a house that had an enormous amount of financial stress in it.
Okay.
Like we were not like a well-off family. And we also had a couple of family tragedies occur during my childhood. And so, my parents were really just almost trying to get by. And I think that's the way it is, honestly, for a lot of parents, which is why they send their kids off to school. They don't try and homeschool them. Because as a parent, you're just like, I've got to get through the day. I've got to put food on the table. I've got to figure out how to keep the lights on. I'm not going to be sitting down and having like a 2-hour conversation with my child about whether or not flight is possible, right? I just don't have the energy or the time, and kids have so much boundless energy. As a parent, you stop listening after like 30 seconds. And you're like, where is this going? So I think as a parent, you have to say realistically, like, I just can't be that person, like I have to help my child develop that imaginative capacity in themselves and figure out how to feed it in themselves and keep it alive in themselves. So my parents were great, but that was not really their focus. And also I come from an immigrant family. So, came to America, very conscious on the idea that really education is there for practical purposes. So as a young child, I was really pointed towards medical school. I spent a lot of time, practicing for standardized tests and other things, which I actually do not think are very healthy or helpful for children. But I became, really excellent at all of those kinds of standardized kind of traditional ways of displaying intelligence. And that pulled me away from stories, that pulled me away from imagination. I became an excellent student on paper, but was not very happy growing up. Got to college, full ride, and then almost wanted to drop out after 2 days because I was like, I just can't take any more of this, And that was when I started to kind of get back in touch when I was in college with, what are you interested in? What is the possibility of your life? Because in college, you have 4 years just to imagine. It's not explained to you that way, right? Nobody thinks about it that way anymore. But you actually have 4 years where you can do anything you want. You can just read. You can tell a new story of your life. You can imagine a new story of the world. And so for me, as great as it was growing up in my household, it wasn't really until I kind of got a little bit older and on my own that I was able to really find that space to really use my full imagination.
Oh, that is so fascinating. So literature has obviously been very meaningful to you throughout your life, and it's been a strong area of study for you. What is it about? I mean, you've already given some of the reasons why, reading in general is so important for us. But what is it about literature itself? So, you had mentioned Dickens, you mentioned Washington Irving, right? So as we think about classic literature, why that versus some of the kind of books that we see today, maybe more fiction type books?
Yeah, and when I was a young person, I did not read a lot of literature. In fact, when I was in college, I didn't read a lot of literature. And so I'm not someone who's like from an early age been like, I gotta sit around reading Shakespeare. Probably the most literary book that I read that was most affecting for me when I was a young person was actually the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I think that'll explain to you a little bit about what I like about literature, because what I loved about the autobiography of Malcolm X was it was a story about a person who changed. I mean, really core when you read that book, 'cause you realize he was a person who came from a certain background, then he changed, and then after he changed, he realized, I'm still not the person I want to be, and he changes again towards the end of the book. And so you see this capacity in him, and that was what really made me start to realize, stories are about changing your own narrative. We're taught in school that stories and storytelling are about changing other people, about persuading them, about marketing, about getting other people to kind of do what we want them to do. But actually, stories are there for personal growth, to help us to imagine the other possibilities in our own life narrative. And, the reason I went on and ended up studying literature and now teach literature was after I got through neuroscience and had done all that work, I started to really think to myself, what is the most imaginative literature? What is the literature out there that really pushes you on an imaginative level? And at first I thought, well, it has to be fantasy or science fiction or something like that. But then I started to realize, no, actually, science fiction and fantasy are actually pretty easy to read. I mean, you can read them pretty quickly, even as a young person. But actually, Shakespeare is much more challenging, because what Shakespeare's doing is he's connecting with you as a human person and then trying to get you to imagine yourself being different. And that's really hard. Imagining an elf that's different isn't that hard. Imagining a future 2,000 years from now that's different isn't really hard. But imagining yourself changing is really hard. All of us have a very hard time imagining ourselves changing. And all of Shakespeare's plays are about individuals trying to change, sometimes tragically, sometimes successfully. And that was when I realized, look, these are the works that I want to study, because they're the most focused on the hardest, but actually the most useful work that we can do as individuals, which is imagine that different story of ourselves.
So thinking along those lines and changing, right? Being able to read stories where we can see ourselves being able to change, and you gave Malcolm X as a great example. That's a fantastic book, by the way. For those who are watching and listening right now, if you have not read that book, please do yourself a favor and do so. So, what were some very specific times in your life where you made a conscious decision to change, to make a change, where you said to yourself, I can become or do something different than I'm doing now and today? Talk to me a bit about your own personal transformation.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking me these questions, first of all, Jake, because I never get a chance to talk about these things, but they're obviously, very personally meaningful to me. So one good example, I was talking about college, is so I got to college and I, just been like the best student. And I got to college and I was taking all these classes and I thought to myself, look, I'm just not really interested in these classes anymore. I just feel like I'm part of this large hamster wheel. Like I'm here to get these grades. And then when I get these grades, and I'll go to a professional school or whatever, and it just felt totally pointless to me. And after I'd been at college for just a couple of days, I called my parents and I was like, look, I think I'm just going to drop out and take a year off because I am just not motivated. And my mom said to me, she goes, wait a minute. She's like, you're at this big college. And what you're trying to tell me is you don't think that there's one person at that entire college that you have something to learn from. You don't think that there's one person at that entire school you have something to learn from. And I was like, I guess that there's someone I have something to learn from. And she goes, find them. And then she hung up the phone. And, strong intervention. And so actually what I did is I sat for myself in the room for a while and I thought to myself, and I wouldn't have done this if it hadn't been for my mom pushing me, and which is why I give her all the credit for this. But I did sit there and I thought to myself, what is it I really care about? And I realized, what I really care about is intelligence in the human brain. I mean, that's what I'm personally interested in. And so at the age of 17, I got out of my dorm room and I walked across the campus to the medical school and I knocked on the door of this brain science lab. And I said, I'd like to study with you guys. And they were completely alarmed because I'd actually somehow managed to navigate the security system. Someone had held the door open for me, not knowing that I wasn't allowed in there. They were like, we don't allow undergraduates in here. We don't allow outsiders in here. We've never even had a graduate student work in this lab. This is entirely like it's like a very special lab. And I basically just convinced them, hey, give me a shot. And so that was a moment where all of a sudden I realized, look, I can choose my own course of study. I can choose my own path in life. We're taught that school are these firm tracks, and we have to go down them, and we have to kind of, take these tests and whatnot. But actually, school is like a library. When you walk into a library, nobody tells you what book you have to read. They might recommend books to you. They might say, hey, you might like this book, but actually you can walk down any aisle you want, pick any book you want, open any page you want, and read that page. And it's the same thing with school, and it's the same thing with life. And so that was one moment which I really started to realize that I had this huge opportunity that I wasn't using. And then after I'd worked in that lab for a while, second big change point, so here you can see my kind of Malcolm Xism, where I don't only change once, I change twice.
Okay.
I'm in this lab, and we're studying the human brain, and this is one of the most cutting edge labs in the world for studying the brain. And everyone at that lab and all the other labs that we're working with are thinking about the human brain as a computer. And this is emerging out of the rise of cognitive science. Probably almost anyone who's listening to the show will have heard lots and lots and lots about things like decision making, data, Bayesian statistics, all sorts of things, And so we were thinking this, this is in the late 90s. We were thinking all that stuff at the time, and it was all very cutting edge at the time. And I was thinking that, this isn't right. This isn't right. And the reason I felt and still feel that it wasn't right is that unlike a computer, humans can be very intelligent with very limited information. A computer can only be smart when it has a lot of data, and that data has to be up to date and has to be reliable. But the human brain evolved in these environments, which were very fast changing environments, very unstable, very murky environments where you couldn't see a lot, and the things you did see were constantly changing. And so it had to figure out how to be smart without a lot of data. And so I thought to myself, there's all these things that are going on in the human brain that are just not computational. And they're not magic, but they're just not computational. And so we have to start studying those parts of intelligence. We have to start to figure out how those work. And everyone in the lab was very nice about that, but they're like, we don't study that at this lab. And also we think that's kind of a little bit crazy. and I sat down and I said, well, what lab can I go to where I can study things like imagination, or I can study intuition, or I can study common sense? Like, what lab can I go to? And they said, well, there's no lab you can go to in the world that studies those things. But I realized I could study those things in literature. And so what I decided to do was go get this PhD in literature, take what I'd learned from literature, and then go back to the lab and try and make that connection between all these parts of human intelligence that we weren't studying in the lab, but that we could study in the lab.
Wow. All right. So you definitely used your own agency and figured out a way to connect some dots that led to your passion and your interests and curiosity and exploring something that hadn't been done before and that wasn't created, and created it. It's amazing.
That's right, yeah. And in a way, it is amazing when you think about it, but then in a way, it's not that amazing, because actually the world is full of millions of humans who are doing that now. And almost everything wonderful in our world now has been created by some entrepreneurial human who just sat down and said, you know what, I think the world is great, but there's something here that we're not doing, or there's something that's missing, or there's something that we could do better. And they took it upon themselves. And for me, at that time of my life, it was a revelation that you could do that, because I'd been so part of a system where I'd always been told, like, here's the next step, here's the next step, here's the next step. And I honestly think our world is getting even more like that. I mean, I think when you see the rise of AI and all these things, people are just looking more and more to other things to tell them what to do and to give them the answers and to say, this is the path. But as humans, we just have this huge opportunity, this huge possibility in our life to do the unprecedented. And almost all of us, when we think about ourselves doing it, are like, I can't do that. But then you just look at the bookshelf and you just think of all the people from history who have done it. I mean, every author, everyone who writes a book, everyone who writes a novel does it. Everyone who starts a business does it. Everyone who invents a technology does it. And so that was my moment where I realized, hey, it's not just that everyone else can do it, I can do it too.
Yeah, I agree with you. On the flip side of that, though, is you asked different questions, right? You had experienced an educational system that many of us experience. Up to a certain point, you weren't satisfied. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but let's say it wasn't challenging you to grow into the person that you believed that you could become, or at least achieve the potential that you were interested in, and exploring your curiosity. But you asked different questions, bigger questions. And I think it's the quality of the questions that we ask that determines the quality of our lives and the actions that we're going to take. So along the lines of questions and curiosity, I would just love to hear from you one or two maybe bigger questions that you're contemplating on today? Those questions that, you just, the really deep, meaningful questions. What are one or two that you're thinking about today? You don't have the answer yet, but they're there.
Yeah, the questions that I'm most fascinated around do have to do with this human ability to see possibilities. And the way it is that the Wright brothers were able to see that the plane was possible, the way it is that entrepreneurs are able to see that the business is possible. And what is fascinating to me about this is that if you talk to most business people today, or in fact, most people today, they'll say, well, possibility is a kind of probability. So they say really what a possibility is it's a low kind of probability. So it might be like, a 5% probability or 10% probability. But actually, we know in the human brain, they're completely different. They function totally differently. A probability is based on things that have happened before. And that allows you to calculate the likelihood that it's going to happen again in a different context. A possibility is something that has never happened, but is not prohibited by the laws of your environment. So it's something that could happen, but hasn't happened. And the more you know the laws of your environment, those laws aren't telling you, hey, you've got to do this. They're instead saying there's an opening here where nobody has ever done that. And this is something you know as a child, because as a child, your parents are constantly telling you the rules of the house, and you're constantly figuring out ways not to break the rules, but to do the things that your parents don't want you to do. So you're figuring out what are the gaps in the system. And that's what possibility is. Possibility is the gaps in the system. It's the things that are allowed but have never happened before. So I'm just totally fascinated by how human beings do that. I'm fascinated by the fact that we do it naturally. I'm fascinated by the fact that when we study senior executives, adults, they do that at about 1% of the rate that they did when they were a child. So as a senior person, you're seeing 1% of the possibilities you saw as a child. You'll notice this if you take a child to like a supermarket or something like that. They'll always be stopping and looking at stuff, and you're like, oh, move on, child, right? There's nothing interesting here, right? You know what I mean?
Right.
These are just cereal boxes, right? But in the child's mind, they're not cereal boxes. They're opportunities, they're possibilities. And as an adult, you see the same number of possibilities in your life, but you're just constantly screening them out. You're constantly filtering them out because you're focused on efficiency. You're focused on productivity. You're focused on what do I think is going to work. You're focused on probability. So the thing that I'm really obsessed with is possibility, how it works in the mind, how we get more of it, how we train it, how we create environments where more of it can be fruitfully exploited, that kind of stuff.
Okay, well, let's explore that then a bit in the time that we have remaining, because I think that's a huge topic and something that I think we can all relate to. It's something that I think about myself, but that statistic that you gave, first of all, it's staggering. I mean, that actually blows my mind that we're using only, that our ability to think about possibility is 1% compared to what it was when we were a child. So give me and you've already hit on this, but I want to go a little more deeply. Why are we challenged with that today? What are we missing? What are we not doing? I mean, you talked about the fact that we're focused on efficiency and productivity and so forth, and I get that, and probably shareholder value and all those other things. But so are there other reasons behind it? And then also, let's talk about what we can do differently, what we can do to tap into more of possibility.
Yeah, so first of all, we're trained out of it. We're trained out of it at school. School is focused almost entirely on standardized tests, which are a form of probability, and they're focused on getting the right answer that the system already has. So anytime you're focused on how do I deliver the answer that the teacher already knows, you're not thinking in possibility, you're thinking in probability. And so we have an entire educational system because of its focus, which isn't, it's not, it's not malicious, but it's just focused on fair assessment. The whole goal of schools is to be fair. And in order to be fair, they need to figure out objective ways to assess things. And in order to figure out objective ways to assess things, they need to figure out questions that already have answers that the system knows, right? That's the only way they can be fair. And so the entire school system just deletes possibility from us as we're growing up. And then you get into a business environment. And what we find is that if you're hired by a business, you're being hired essentially to maintain their existing operations. So you're being hired to maintain what worked yesterday. That's your main job in a business. And if you're an entrepreneur or you start to get to a senior leadership position in the business, you are starting to think about how do we do things new, how do we innovate? But that's almost always with a mind to what has worked before, what has worked for us before, what's worked for our competitors before. And so almost everything in all of these environments is totally focused on the past. And AI is the quintessential example of this. I hear all the time about how AI is somehow going to take over and do all these interesting things. And of course, it's not going to do any of those things because AI, like every computer, thinks in patterns. Its power is pattern recognition. And when you're thinking in patterns, you're again thinking in probabilities, and you're again not thinking in possibilities. And so these are all ways of detecting trends, of detecting things that have worked, but they're not ways of imagining ways things could work differently. So a couple of things that people can do if they're interested in this other way of thinking. The first, again, comes from U.S. Army Special Operations. The reason I started working with them is they have a small group of people whose job it is to predict the future, essentially. And when I got there, I was like, well, do you predict the future by statistically kind of, amalgamating all these probabilities and stuff like that? And they say, no. The way we predict the future is we imagine things that haven't happened yet but could, and then we try and make it happen. So actually, we're not so much predicting the future as making the future. That's kind of our job, is to be kind of one step ahead. And so I said, okay, well, how do you do that? And they said, well, we do it by trying to detect what we call exceptional information. Exceptional information. It's a totally weird military term. When I first heard it, I was like, you've got to come up with a better way of saying it than exceptional information. But now the more I've gotten into it, the more I'm like, I kind of like it because it's so weird and Army. So exceptional information is basically an exception to a rule.
Okay.
It's something that breaks a rule. And the way that you know an exception is because something surprises you in your environment. You say, whoa, okay, I was not expecting that. And then what you're trained to do by school is rationalize that exception and explain it away. So say, oh, it's actually not that surprising. Here's the explanation for it. Or I'll go on Google and find the reason that it's that way. Or I'll say, oh, you know what, it's just noise. So this is classic in statistics. Anytime something's weird and they can't explain it, they just say, oh, it'll regress to the mean, right? That's when you know you're talking to a quant, is if they can't explain something, they just say, oh, it'll regress to the mean. But what special operators do is they say, no, that thing shows that more is possible in this system than history predicts. That is something that could happen more. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start to double down on that exception. And so what they always do is they say, well, what happens if that one exception became, 2 of itself or 5 of itself, or everything became that exception? Simple example of this, if any of your audience likes art, back in the 19th century, the rules of color were red, green, blue were the primary colors. Someone came along, spotted an exception to that. The exception was yellow. Then they doubled down on that yellow and made it everything. And that painting was called Sunflowers. And the painter was Vincent van Gogh. And so you see, that's a simple way that you see an exception, you double down on it. So that's tip 1. Tip 2 is optimism. Optimism. What we find is a lot of people see possibilities and then they back away from them. And why do they back away from them? Because they say to themselves, well, it's not probable that that's going to happen. And it's not probable that's going to happen because it's never happened before. So I have no example for it happening before. And so we say, no, you have to start becoming an optimist. And the challenge there is a lot of times when people hear optimism, they think magical thinking or manifestation or these kinds of things like this will happen. The moment you've gotten into will happen, you're outside of possibility. Possibility is could happen. So instead what we say to people is we say, no. If you want to build your optimism, start thinking back to moments in your own life when you did something that surprised you. And start thinking about moments in the world where something happened that surprised you. And then what that tells your brain is this could happen. Not this will happen, but this could happen. And the more you get in the habit of thinking this could happen, the more that when you see exceptions, you lean into them and say, where could this go? And you start to find yourself in this habit, like you were as a child, of exploring the possibilities of your environment rather than trying to race to the most likely outcome.
Wow. Okay. So exceptional information. We double down on the exception itself, optimism, focus on what could happen. So let me ask you about that optimism piece, if we could dig a little deeper on that for just a moment. What I find is in today's environment, and I don't want to put everybody in the same bucket, that wouldn't be fair, but let's just say generally speaking, when there is a lot of negativity, negative information coming our way, if you're consumed with the news and politics and you name it, all the other things going on in the world, and it becomes challenging to be optimistic about a future state, what can we do? And to add to that, we have a negativity bias. What are some tactical things that we can do or that you have seen that have worked that can help us maybe reframe some of that negativity and really focus and find that optimism? Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm asking.
It makes sense.
It the right
sense.
way.
No, it makes great sense. But remember, I don't believe in logic. So I don't believe in things like reframing. I don't believe in these computer approaches. Instead, what I believe is something called anti-fragility. So I have to brace your. So let me just say a couple things real quick before I go into this. So first of all, everything I say is very different from what many people will say, and so I just want your audience to be aware of the fact that, like, if some of my stuff sounds odd, they should be aware that it is odd. And second of all, even though I work with a lot of elite military units and a lot of elite businesses, I know nothing about war. I know nothing about business. All I know is this very tiny thing, which is about how narrative works in the brain. And so that's where all this comes from. And so I encourage people to be open to the possibility of what I'm saying, but don't take me as some kind of expert. Just kind of see how this kind of plays out in your own life. So, what I would say in terms of these negative things is, yes, absolutely, everything you're saying is true. First of all, fear is the most powerful emotion in the human brain. Fear actually evolved to make us susceptible to influence. That's how it works. So the more scared you get, the more you tend to retreat and become conservative or do what everyone else around you is doing. I mean, that's that. We could talk about that if you want to understand the neural mechanisms behind that. But I think you know all that, right? That's all pretty clear. What people don't talk about so much is the fact that the human brain evolved to be anti-fragile. What does anti-fragile mean? Well, what anti-fragile means is the human brain evolved to get smarter from mistakes and stronger from damage. Kind of classic example, this is your bones. If you break a bone, it heals back stronger in that place. But all of us have wisdom in our life. All that wisdom has come from messing up. Like something bad happened, and then we developed wisdom, And so actually what that's teaching you is that logically, so life, right? It's not logical, it's biological. In logic, good things come from good. In biology, good things come from bad. That's how it works. So you got to start saying to yourself is instead of trying to screen out the negative or reframe the negative or dissociate. So a lot of mindfulness, all this kind of stuff, this is all dissociation. We don't want to dissociate. Instead, what we want to do is we want to think back in our own life to times when something bad led to something good. And when we were challenged, and it was hard, and we responded to that challenge positively. Now, that might only be 1% of the time. That might be less than 1% of the time, right? It might be totally improbable. But the fact that it happened once means that it could happen again. And so the more you start to focus on those moments in your own life when you were able to take the negative energy around you and turn it around and do something positive, the more you develop that capacity to eat negativity and get stronger from it in the present. So the main thing that I just say to people is, if all this negative stuff in the present, right, around you is getting you down, focus on yourself, focus on your own story, think about a time when something good came out of something bad through your own agency, then open yourself up to the present, see how you can start to take all those negative things and use them to fuel your optimism, feed your sense of resilience, become anti-fragile. So this is the kind of training that we do a lot with first responders, with medics, with EMTs, with firefighters, and of course, special operators. I mean, what happens in these environments are terrible things. People die. You see shocking things, but by seeing those shocking things, you can learn, how do I help people better in the future? How do I develop wisdom from that? How do I grow from that? How do I realize that more is possible in life than I thought before that tragedy happened? So that rather than, dissociating through drinking or other kinds of things, we focus on the fact that our brain has remembered that tragedy and has remembered those negative emotions. Remember, negative emotions come from our own brain. They don't come from the environment. Our brain made them. How do we take those, use them to become stronger?
That's incredible. And, I wrote about our own story, the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves not that long ago. And, I know you do a lot of research on this, but it's so interesting to me. I go back in time and I think about all the negative, those negative self-talk and all the stories that I was telling myself about myself early in life and things that I had to work to overcome, and realizing that those stories I was telling myself really weren't true. But I didn't know it at the time because I didn't have the self-awareness. But those stories that we do tell ourselves about ourselves, the impact that has on our lives is tremendous. It is tremendous. And the thing that is scary to me about that is that we'll go to the ends of the earth to find the evidence to support the storyline that we're telling ourselves, negative or positive. So you've given us some...
No. I mean, that's the dangerous thing about story, right? Is if you get locked in the idea that there's one story, then you try and have everything confirm it. I mean, and that's why a lot of rationalists don't like story. Just a couple things on that real quick, if we have time.
Okay, sure.
The first thing is just speaking for myself, a lot of negative stories that I tell myself about myself are true. I have done bad things in my life, and I have seen bad things in my life. But what makes me a strong person is that I can accept those negative stories and fold them into a larger positive story of myself, in which I grow from those negative things, So it's not necessarily about not telling yourself negative stories about yourself. I mean, if you do something that you're embarrassed or ashamed by, you should be able to look at yourself and say candidly, like, I did that and I was that bad person. You know what I mean? And realizing that your stronger stories get stronger and your good stories get better from the negative stories. So you don't have to distinguish and get rid of the negative stories, right? You can learn to use them again as this source of growth, this source of power. Now, if you're only focused on the negative, that's not going to happen. So, but I just want to encourage people to know you don't have to get rid of the negative stories. You can eat those negative stories. You can use those as stories, as sources of power too.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point, and I really do appreciate you sharing it that way, because when you had kind of pushed back on me and said, "No, don't reframe those," right? I spend a lot of time reframing and using different language around those stories, but what you're teaching me, which I really appreciate, is to not do that, to really own the whole story, right? Because there's all different parts and pieces to it. There's going to be the negative stuff. There's going to be the positive stuff. Where I think we can get ourselves into a sticky thicket, and I remember I interviewed Dr. Ethan Cross, and we were talking about chatter and all that negative self-talk, and when it really becomes all-consuming, right? If we don't have the tools to be able to break some of those patterns and some of that self-talk, it can be very difficult to get out of that, and that can lead to other problems, anxiety, obviously depression, etc. But I think the fact that we can use the tools that you've provided us and really look holistically at our story, and to what I said, own it all. It makes up who you are and who we are, and it allows us to become anti-fragile. And I love that.
Yeah, and I just have to say, your brain isn't going to be convinced by reframing. I mean, what we know is that, your brain is holding on to those really negative experiences and it really believes them. And so what you have to do is you have to go to the bottom of them and own those negative experiences and learn from them. And I do think that a lot of modern psychiatric care is focused on these very superficial fast fixes rather than trusting the deep strength that we have inside ourselves. And so really, if you're having a hard time, don't focus on the negative stuff. Go back, focus on the positive things, strengthen those positive things, and then start to revisit the negative things and start to integrate them into the positive things. We do this work all the time with operators who have PTS, post-traumatic stress, who have, who blame themselves for people's deaths, all
right.
Very intense things, And I want to assure people that if you have the right support around you, you can take those negative feelings and you can wrap them into your own positive story in a way that your brain will really believe. And that all starts with, again, focusing on those positive things that you believe. Don't allow other people to tell you what's positive about yourself. That doesn't work either. If people are like, hey, you're great in these ways. If you don't believe that, you don't believe that. Spend some time. And if you can't find something in your immediate past, think back to when you were a kid. Because as a kid, you did some things that were extraordinary. Every kid does things that are extraordinary because it's really hard to be a kid. We don't talk about this very much in our modern society because we sort of idealize childhood and we think, oh, it's this wonderful time free of responsibility. Being a child is really hard. You have to learn to walk. You have to learn to talk. You have to learn to do all these kinds of things. You did those things. Remember those moments, strengthen them in your mind, and then start to think about the things that are challenging you now and realize that those challenges are gifts and that if you own them, they make you stronger.
Man, that is so good. Can I ask you just very briefly about identity and how that maybe plays a role in what we're talking about right now? And let me give you a specific example. Let's take a Navy SEAL or a special ops individual, and their time with the service is now up. But they've identified themselves as that person for so many years. And then when they leave that role, often they feel empty. They feel like, where is my purpose? I mean, this really gave me that life's purpose and being in my community and doing important work. So can you just briefly speak to that identity piece if you're able to, and how would we use the same tools and strategies, if you will, that we're talking about when it comes to the story that we tell ourselves to help us have our identity evolve?
So I don't like people to think in terms of identity. Identity is another word for equation. What thinks an equation? Computers. Our focus now in the modern world with identity, whether it's individual identity or group identity, is more of a result of this emphasis we have on quantitative approaches, demographics, statistics. All this is coming out of this emphasis we have on identity. Instead, I want people to focus on what's unique about their own personal story. And, I work a lot with soldiers, to your point, who are shifting roles. And it is very challenging for them. But really what's challenging about it is not so much the loss of identity, but to your point, it's the loss of purpose. And the loss of purpose comes from the fact that they're entering a civilian society that doesn't know what it's doing. When you're in the Army, you have this sense of, I'm putting my life on the line to support democracy. I'm putting my life on the line to give other people freedom. And then these warriors come into a civil society and everyone's like, I'm trying to make some money so that I can do some things. I'm not exactly sure what it is. And it's very disorientating for people in the Army because they have this very intense sense of purpose and direction. And how do I take that same intense sense of purpose that I had and that drew me to military service and find that in my civilian life? And so what I always say to them is that's your gift and that's your opportunity because the civilian world needs that. People in the civilian world don't have the same intense sense of satisfaction that you have when they look back over those critical missions that you've performed. They don't think back their own career that way. That's why people often talk about things like work-life balance, which is another thing I dislike. I dislike the idea, as you might imagine, of balance and harmony and these kinds of things. Right? I believe in a purposeful life, and I think if your job is part of your purpose, you should live it intensely. And if your job isn't part of your purpose, I think you should quit it and find another job or do something else. And so, when we're working with individuals, and again, this is a kind of deep counseling, and this is why, again, I give the disclaimer that, I'm an intense person, and I work with intense people, and this level of intensity may not be appropriate for everyone at every moment of their life, Again, thinking back to my parents just trying to put food on the table. But if you are ready for this moment, and more importantly, if you see that the people in your life are ready for this moment, and you want to help young people grow up and develop that sense of purpose so they don't get stuck in the same kind of corridors that young people are getting stuck in now, sitting them down and saying, what's something you took personal pride in? What was a moment? We talk about something a lot. We call it dumb pride. So, dumb pride is basically something that you're proud of that everyone else thinks is stupid. Why are you so proud you did that, And you realize when you think back on those moments, you realize, the reason I'm proud of that is because it was really me. I was doing something that was different there and that was right for me. And I always make people do this test with dumb pride, which is I make them say, look, if you did that thing and it didn't work out, if the worst possible situation, worst possible outcome occurred, would you still do it? And if they say yes, then that really is dumb pride, because what they're saying is that's my personal purpose. And so what I say is take some time every day and think about that moment. Think about that moment until you find your purpose in the present, because the answer lies inside. The answer lies inside. And all of us are getting lost nowadays because we are looking for the answer on the internet. We're looking for the answer in other people's lives. We're looking for the answer in influencers, and what that's causing is a kind of short-term distraction. We're constantly being ripped out of our own narrative. We're unable to do the hard thing, which is sustain a purpose over time, which is narrative. Narrative is sustained purpose over time as opposed to logic, which is a bunch of things that are associated simultaneously. And think back, dwell on your own past, dwell on those moments of dumb pride. You'll find the courage and the opportunity in the present to encounter those moments again. And whenever I talk to service people who are having, and there are many of them, believe me, who are having very satisfying civilian lives, it's because they had that courage to break from the pack, follow their own sense of personal purpose, stop looking to the world to tell them what to do, stop looking for that validation, and instead tell their own story.
Brilliant. And I tell you, one of the things that I absolutely love about this conversation and about you in particular is that you're really pushing me and challenging my beliefs and challenging me to think differently. And I truly do appreciate that. And this has been such a fascinating conversation. So as we're wrapping up, just a couple of quick things. First, if you had to distill your life's work down to one sentence that you were to leave behind, what would it say?
What I want to train leaders. And the way that I think we train leaders is we encourage people to say to other people, that was smart, and I wouldn't have done it that way. That was smart, and I wouldn't have done it that way. And I think that if that sentence is on my tombstone, that was smart and I wouldn't have done it that way. If we can just say more of that sentence to kids, right? Instead of, you know what, you could do it better if you do it my way, or our employees. Because what we're doing there by trying to give people the right answer fast is we're stopping them from developing their own leadership capacity, their own individual narrative, their ability to contribute in ways that we can't foresee, to create the future in these really original ways. So I think more than anything else, that sentence, that was smart and I wouldn't have done it that way, that would be my legacy.
That's so good. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then finally, is there a question, Angus, that you would have liked to have been asked that we didn't discuss or that I didn't ask you?
No, I think this is an extraordinary conversation. It's one of the best conversations I've had that I can remember. I feel like we went directions I wasn't expecting to go. I feel like you did a great job of asking me the who, what, when, where without the why, and we just sort of kind of ranged over topics. And I also really appreciate the fact that, we were able to have a conversation which you could say to me, hey, Angus, some of your ideas were challenging me, which I know is a little bit of you saying, I got to think about whether I'm on board with some of this stuff. I got thrown out the first time I started working with special operators. Got thrown out of the room for a lot of the stuff that I was saying. Yeah, because first of all, I went in there and they were like, what's a good way that we could improve our performance? And I was like, well, you know what? You should probably stop chewing tobacco and all this caffeine. And they just threw me out of the room. They're like, all right, we've had enough. The nickname they gave me actually after that was Atheist Jesus, because, it's like I was very holier than thou,
okay,
but was, not connected to an actual higher power. But so I'm used to that, and I like these kinds of challenging conversations because I feel like I also learn from them as well. So I appreciate you humoring me and listening to me, and I look forward to future conversations in this vein.
As do I. And Angus, I want to, again, thank you so very much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. Truly an enlightening, inspiring, and thought-provoking conversation. And for that, I am forever grateful. And I know our audience is going to appreciate what you've shared. And I really do hope for all of you that are watching and listening that this has challenged you as well, and that it has really pushed you to ask different questions and to go deeper within, right? Because your story is your story. Own all of it. You've learned a lot here. And Angus, thank you. I'm super grateful for you.
Thank you, Jay. I'm honored.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And for all of you, again, I want to thank you so very much for watching and for listening. Quick favor, would you please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment for us on Apple Podcast? That helps us expand our reach and attract incredible guests just like Angus. And to listen to more podcasts, all you need to do is visit Scherr Business Consulting, click that podcast button, And until next time, my friends, keep learning, keep growing. Make sure you run out to pick up a copy of Primal Intelligence. We're going to provide a link in the show notes, and we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.